Okay, calm down.
Séamus Malekafzali is a journalist who writes for places like The Baffler and The Nation, and he covers the Middle East and the Global South. So welcome, Séamus.
Happy to be on.
Thank you for coming on.
It's a pleasure.
So tell us, first of all, what brought you to Lebanon in the first place? How long had you been living there, and what had you been doing there?
I had initially gone to school in Beirut a few years ago while I was still doing an undergraduate education. And I fell in love with Beirut completely, honestly. I mean, it's right on the Mediterranean, beautiful city, deeply involved in its politics and its history. It was magnetic. Um, I always dreamed of moving back, and then in 2023, in August 2023, I got my opportunity to move there. And then once October 2023 rolled around, obviously conditions changed there. Um, so I had been living there almost full time for just over a year. Um, I had to leave only a couple days ago.
I wanted to ask you about, I mean, kind of a general question to discuss what is happening right now, what the latest news is. I mean, the last 48 hours, there's been a major escalation, over 500 killed, and the most massacred in a day in Lebanon since 2006.
Yeah, I mean, I had left Lebanon on account of the fact that it was clear that this round of escalation was going to be more different than the other ones. Um, I had felt this worry and anxiousness before, but never like after the fact of the pager attacks, something completely unprecedented in every way, shape, or form. Um, After that happened, the airstrikes from Israel became so immense. I mean, we're talking about, I want to say literally thousands of airstrikes occurred just yesterday on southern Lebanon, including at least one in South Beirut. Um, just total carnage. And that was, of course, met by Hezbollah coming in, bombing places that they had never bombed before, even I believe during 2006, going towards Haifa, bombing West Bank settlements, which I haven't even conceived of them doing in really any conflict scenario. Um, Again, this entire conflict has been a long procession into uncharted territory, um, in which we continue to break precedents in ways that I can't predict after a certain point, at least the certain specifics of where things go.
How did you experience these attacks? Where were you when they happened?
I didn't live in South Beirut. I lived in a neighborhood that was in southern Beirut, so I didn't hear much of it. But um, within Beirut proper, there were of course ambulances going up and down blocks. You could feel that there was something amiss, even if many of the pager explosions didn't happen inside the city itself. But I did know journalists who were at least at the funeral for some of the children who had been killed, some of the healthcare workers who had been killed, and when the walkie-talkies exploded, they witnessed those. I mean, people's hands being blown off, smoke rising from the crowds. Um, these things were designed to create situations in which crowds would attract them, and then cause carnage within that created chaos.
And what did you think of the way the media covered this?
It was completely atrocious. I don't think that's terribly surprising, but it was throughout all of the coverage of Gaza in particular. There has been this desire to swallow up the joy that certainly exists in the minds and the hearts of pro-Western media figures, because of how bad the carnage is, how bad the destruction is, how much killing there has been. So they have to dress it up in obfuscatory languages, like they don't really want to do it. But with this, it's all out there. All of the joy, all of the wonder at the ingenuity of the Israeli army, that's all on the table. So you have even ostensibly neutral, objective outlets in the New York Times talking about how ingenious this was, how it's an example of strategic prowess on the part of the Israeli army. Um, it's something that sounds like it's out of a spy thriller. So therefore, they can take that and they can add a bunch of superlatives to it, and they could portray Israel in a better light than they otherwise would be able to.
There are a couple of disgusting examples, and people were making all these great jokes about, I guess, people's genitals being exploded. Bunch of people on Twitter making jokes about this, how this is gender reassignment surgery. Even like a pediatrician made a joke about that. I think we're seeing. I mean, it's such a masks off moment where you see people celebrating carnage. I was curious if any uh, examples kind of stood out for you of media outlets or any tropes. I mean, one that stood out for me is the way this was presented as a Hezbollah pager attack, which meant that if you weren't paying attention, you may have thought it was Hezbollah who had done it.
I mean, a lot of the most egregious examples you're talking about, these are just random Twitter users. There's a lot of them, mind you, way too many of them. But for the most part, within the media, it was mostly things that stuck out to me was this total paving over of really any of the civilian casualties, of which there were quite some. Um, I mean, in the Atlantic in particular, it was automatically paved over to every single one of these wounded. So thousands of Hezbollah fighters were wounded. If you had read that and you had only read that, you would come away with the assumption that this was a highly targeted, highly
Right.
specific attack that, you know, only targeted the absolute worst of the worst. Therefore, how can you really object to it unless you're a terrorist apologist? Meanwhile, I mean, I personally assume that this is more of a targeted attack, but that assumption only lasted about 5 minutes, maybe 10. Once it became clear of the scope of it, where these attacks occurred, where they were blown up, it became really clear that they had no idea who had these pagers, where they were at the time, anything about them other than the fact that they were in somebody's possession. So that meant that, you know, these went off in grocery stores, these went off in marketplaces, went off in people's cars, in hospitals, regardless of who they belong to. You know, you really like, are you really about to make the claim that a little girl who is holding a pager in her hand that belongs to her father when it gets blown up, that is a Hezbollah fighter? If you made that claim about, if I were to, if we were to reverse this and say that this
Right.
was an attack that was directed at Israel, and you wrote that down, and the exact opposite situation had occurred where, let's go even further. Let's say the daughter of an Israeli soldier
Sure.
had the pager when it exploded. If you paved over that, you would have been railroaded by everyone for erasure of civilian casualties, of the injuries of children. But in the case of Arabs, when they're affected by it,
Right.
that that's no matter.
Right. And
Yeah.
then you have the oh, it's the father's fault. We got some
Yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
those. Yeah.
It's
Lots of.
Katerji. I remember this.
Oh
That
yeah.
was,
He wasn't the only one, but he's like the gift that keeps on giving.
yeah,
Um,
God.
it was a common thing. I mean, because of this like utter dehumanization of Arab life that you're referring to, people don't even know that what they're saying is so offensive because
No,
it's so
it's
acceptable.
when you have created such broad generalizations, when you pave over all of the complexities that exist in Lebanon, you eventually get to a position in which, okay, if it's targeted at the bad guys, that we were told are the bad guys, then anything that is done in pursuit of that objective is fine, it's acceptable. Especially considering like everything else bad that has happened during this war, like in Gaza, where you saw how there's no you can't even make like a serious claim that it's highly targeted, highly specific, unless you're a total IDF apologist. Here, you might be able to make a claim that, oh, this is how it should be, this is how it ought to be. and therefore pointing out what's wrong with it, you're taking out of line in some way or another.
Right. You talked about the joy that people are demonstrating, and one of those people is Senator John Fetterman. Here he is sharing his thoughts about what Israel just did in Lebanon. Let's take a look.
Senator Bernie Sanders accused Prime Minister Netanyahu of sabotaging a deal. Take a look at what he said.
Every time a deal appears close, Netanyahu moves the goalposts, introducing new demands and torpedoing the deal. It is clear to me that Netanyahu is prolonging the war in order to cling to power.
Senator, you have stood firmly behind Israel, but do you agree with any part of what your colleague, Senator Sanders, said there?
No, not at all. And I want to be very clear. I thought what Israel chose to do about blowing up the pagers and then walkie-talkies, and then after targeting and eliminating membership and leadership of Hezbollah, I absolutely support that. In fact, if anything, I love it. And Israel demonstrated that they will not allow terrorists not to be held accountable. And I fully support that. And it's not about nothing that has what my colleague has said.
He loves it.
I had heard about this clip, and I knew it was on the major text, but I didn't know that he included the strike in South Beirut, which absolutely, like, it killed entire families, buried them under the rubble. I believe some of them are still missing under that rubble. Killed way more children, killed way more women than the Beirut attacks did. But doesn't matter. It's against Hezbollah. It's against the bad guys. He was for absolutely everything that happened in Gaza. Why would he change his opinion here? I don't know if this is a related, part of this conversation, but I'm still very confused as to why he's part of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
With all honesty, he doesn't seem to be in alignment with even more conservative members of the party on this. He's gone completely in an insane direction on this.
Yeah.
War.